I'm Teresa Mangum. I'm the director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Iowa. And this year, we're having a series of these internet conversations about what is research now. One of the things I'm very excited about with our guest today is that I've long been fascinated that people in humanities departments are often doing one kind of research as funders sometimes shift to fund other kinds of research. And this seems like an interesting opportunity to bring those sets of people together, those conversations together. I hope so. And we will also have, this series will continue. So we'll have another event focused on podcast as research. Next spring, we'll have a session with collaborative artists about how they're thinking about their work as research and how that work is assessed and valued. And we also have a wonderful team from the University of Iowa, led by Ted Abel, of neuroscientists. But part of what they've discovered is to do that kind of research, you need people who think about mind, plasticity, biology. And so it's a great example of what I think of as radical interdisciplinarity, and then the challenges that poses for evaluation. So I'm going to very quickly introduce our guest for today, and then off we'll go. And in alphabetical order, John Paul Christie is the Senior Director of Fellowships and Public Programs at the American Council of Learned Societies. And John Paul has led many efforts, but one that's very exciting is the Mellon ACS Scholars and Society Fellowships that embed scholars with public partner organizations, which poses, again, very interesting challenges for assessment and valuation. Kim Gallon is Professor of History, African American Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Purdue University, though she's working at Johns Hopkins right now. And she is the author of Pleasure in the News, African American Readership and Sexuality in the Black Press, and also has been the leader and contributor to a number of really exciting digital projects, another area where we're still wrestling with evaluation, I think. And those include the Black Press Research Collective and COVID Black, a task force on Black health and data. And she's also created curriculum for a project we know well at the University of Iowa, the Colored Conventions project online. And finally, Christopher Long is the Foundation Professor and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Michigan State University. And he's also a professor there and directs a really amazing Mellon-funded initiative called the Humane Metrics Initiative, HU Metrics HSS, which you should all find on online as soon as we finish this conversation. And it's a values-based, mission-driven way of thinking about our work, our research, and how to reward that work. And so we've had Chris here and Jason along with him. So let me quickly introduce Jason before I jump in with Chris. Jason Rohde is the program director for digital culture, the Media and Democracy Program, and the Social Data Initiative, which includes the Social Data Research and Dissertation Fellowship Program at the Social Science Research Council. And he works with Chris on the Humetrics project. And we were just thrilled to have them here a couple of years ago, leading a workshop that we might hear about today. But Chris, I wonder if you could start us off, and I'm going to welcome all of you on the panel to just jump in if you have questions. You don't have to wait for me either. But Chris, what to share with this group, what does values-based assessment, what does that mean?
Oh, thank you, Teresa. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone today. And let me just say at the outset, you have very generously given me the directorship of a program that really is a truly collaborative program. So Jason is a leader, co-PI on that. I see Rebecca Kennison here is on the call as well, co-PI. So we have six co-PIs on that, and it's really one of our values is collaboration, and so being sure to affirm that in public as we need to is an example of the kind of what we're actually moving to talking about as values enacted scholarship. And the reason why we've kind of moved from talking about values based to values enacted is because the Humetrics initiative is really animated by the conviction that the challenges we're facing in higher education are traceable to a kind of contradiction at the heart of what we do. We say we value things like interdisciplinary research and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and publicly engaged scholarship. Almost every one of the, certainly major research universities, certainly public ones, explicitly articulate those values in their mission statements. And yet we have tenure and promotion processes and advancement processes for non-tenure system faculty that do not align with those values, that force faculty who are doing publicly engaged work, transdisciplinary work, work that is connected with minoritized communities, to do a lot of extra work explaining how this counts as this or that, whether it's research, teaching, or service. So the Humetrics initiative is really oriented toward identifying and defining the whole concept of quality and excellence in terms of how aligned we are with the values we say we care most deeply about, and really thinking intentionally about how we're identifying those values. So one of the things we found in the work that we've done in workshops like we did at the University of Iowa is that giving faculty and administrators the opportunity to reflect upon the values they care most deeply about and to talk about those values together in a space we hope to create as relatively psychologically safe, and so that you can be vulnerable and authentic with each other in thinking about that. And then moving them through a process of thinking about, okay, well, if those are your values, values of openness, values of diversity, values of transparency, whatever they may be, how are you putting them into practice in the work that you do, in the scholarship that you do, in the teaching that you do, in all the aspects that make up a rich and lively administrative life, and what Jason likes to call some even the micro transactions, the way that we reach out to colleagues to potentially collaborate. Well, how are you shaping that email? Does that have the values you say you care about most are you using email too, or are you picking up the phone? How are you, I mean, so it goes all the way down. And so that's been the work that we've been focused on. It's very exciting, but also requires a lot of a self-reflection and a willingness to recognize one's own failings when one doesn't live up to the values that one professes to care about.
Chris, can I ask you a question about that? Is
Yeah.
it okay, Teresa? I know you wanted us to engage in.
Oh, go.
So let me just affirm everything you're saying, and it's music to my ears. And in some sense, I know that you were doing this work pre-pandemic, but in some sense, I would argue that the pandemic has asked us all to do that reflection around values, both personally and then as institutions. And so my question to you is, for many people who may be invested in a certain way of measuring what scholarship looks like, what progress looks like, what achievement looks like. Have you seen or experienced any pushback with particular individuals wanting and are invested in a particular way about thinking about the values of higher education or your specific institution?
Yes, we have experienced the pushback. So one of the aspects of this initiative has been for us to interview over 120 people from every Big Ten academic alliance institution about the tenure and promotion process, talking about how values may or may not be enacted in their processes. So as you can imagine, we in that experience, in that research, in those interviews, we did hear a lot of different kinds of stories, both the stories of the many faculty and administrators who are just hungry for this kind of change, and also the recalcitrance, the kind of sense that you know, we know what counts as excellent, and it's bound up with a kind of prestige economy that that we have to really push intentionally back against. I would say one thing in relationship to the COVID question that you're bringing up, Kim, is we're absolutely seeing a kind of opening for more creative thinking and more potentially flexibility around some of these issues. But one of the things that I'm very sensitive to is what we're advocating for is an elevation of the quality of scholarship, because we're asking people to, you know, walk the talk, to actually put their values into concrete practice in specific ways. Right now, the way scholarship works in many research universities is we privilege one aspect, namely the so-called category of research, over teaching and service. And so, you know, shifting that conversation has been a really important component, and shifting it not to something that feels less than, but actually something that is in fact more holistic. The ways in which people are weaving their teaching and their service into their research portfolios, that's where the future lies. And that's a higher standard, in fact, than those who have just kind of, you know, published in some very small places and had 5 or 10 readers. And yet that seems to be, you know, the standard of excellence. So we're trying to move that forward.
And that's actually a great lead in to one of the questions I hope Jill might think about, and that is an example, a really concrete example of a particular project that you've been part of, I imagine in your case, Kim, or that you had helped to fund or to move along, you know, to support the faculty members. And I'll start with you, John Paul, just because I'm familiar with the amazing projects in the Scholar and Society Awards. And I wonder, what does a project look like that does exactly what Chris said, that integrates what we try to keep so tightly separate when we go through evaluation processes, that you think just helps us really see the challenges?
Thank you, Teresa. I think that it's a difficult question, but I also think it could be answered in many different ways, and I'm looking forward to hearing what my co-panelists would suggest as well. Because ACLS funds lots of projects every year, it's hard to pick one, but one that's been recently sort of thrust into the spotlight is the Marking Time project that Nicole Fleetwood was supported by ACLS, but also by the Whiting Foundation to pursue her project on art in the age of mass incarceration, and really what she calls carceral aesthetics. This is a project that crosses boundaries between research, curation, public engagement, that has involved really careful consideration about the ways that scholars work with the people who are co-creating knowledge in the public, the objects of inquiry, but also the people who are creating those objects. And I really feel like that particular project, one that was recently singled out, or Nicole was recently singled out for a MacArthur Award just this last month, is one that has taken an interesting trajectory. So one of the things I would say about this is that some of these projects take on different dimensions over time, these longer term projects, and that sort of careful and thoughtful planning and an openness to working with various constituencies, to lifting them up and making sure that they have voices in the project, are things that can take precedence at different moments in a project. But you can tell in one like Marking Time that it's never been forgotten at any one moment of its instantiation. So that's one that I wanted to bring up, because it has gone from a small exhibit to MoMA, has gone even in the question of thinking about what kind of publication it should be, thinking about should it be a trade publication or an academic publication, where does and interestingly, the question of where sort of disciplinarily it lives has been always in tension, I think, from American studies to cultural studies to art history, to African American studies, but in participating in all of them, but and sort of defying pigeonholing. And so that is something that I wanted to put out there as one that we could probably talk about from many different vantage points. But it's one that seems to touch on a lot of the things that, including the collaborative nature of work that happens between scholars working in the academy and people producing art, culture, knowledge outside of the academy.
That's such a wonderful example, and also a great example of a person who, rather than choose a safe route, took so many risks all along the way to, because her project defied understanding so often as she moved, as the collaborations extended and grew, left the university even. So that's a really, really helpful example. Are there other examples that you all would offer? Jason, do you have an example that challenges us also?
Sure, absolutely. And I just want to emphasize some of the points that John Paul raised, and put amplify the fact that, as he notes, the humanities and social sciences are permeating our national discourse right now, right? They are the most relevant and necessary disciplines and topics and subjects, more so than I can remember in a long time. And you look at the news today, we have arguments about whether or not a racist legacy of harm is appropriate to teach as part of our nation's history in public classrooms. Yet, for the record, it absolutely is. We have arguments about the most effective ways to combat misinformation around a pandemic that's ravaging our communities. We have arguments about the role of companies that are not computer science companies so much as they're social science companies, right? Like these social media companies, and what their role should be in our political discourse and our democratic process. So, like, I just want to say that it's so heartening to see how relevant the humanities and social sciences are to the work of the world around us. I guess I would lift up a graduate student fellow of ours as just one example of graduate student work that's really captivated me. This dissertation fellow in the Social Data Initiative named Crystal Lee. She's a PhD candidate at MIT and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center. And her project looks at data visualization. So you recall, like, the flatten the curve and other kinds of visualizations related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what she looks at is how these visualizations circulate online, and then how people use the same data and the same visualizations to argue very different points, right? So we presume that we're coming at two different angles, but what she shows is that, and she looked at, like, she pulled together, I think, 500,000 tweets and over 40,000 visualizations that were embedded in those tweets. And then she did an ethnography of COVID skeptic groups. So it's this really rich combination of computational social science, history and humanities, ethnographies and anthropology. And in kind of her words, how skeptics, she says, how do skeptics use orthodox data practices to support unorthodox views? And so really using the same approaches to interpretation, the same data, but coming to radically different kinds of results. And what's lovely about her work too is that she's publicly engaged. She talks to policymakers directly. They reach out to her and say, can you come talk to us? She made a video short of, like, her research to better explain, how her research was significant in the spaces. She speaks actively in reporters and does op-ed. So, like, there's this combination of publicly engaged scholarship but also deeply relevant conversations about what's going on in our world. So maybe I'll leave it there, but I think that's a great example of how somebody's moving across disciplines, across methodologies, and in different kinds of public spaces in order to highlight the necessity of the work that she's doing.
And I'm curious, Jason, what is her discipline?
So it's funny, it's MIT, so they have different kinds of departments. She's affiliated with the History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society group. So, which again gives you a lovely, rich, diversity of disciplines coming together.
And I partly ask because it does seem to me that the productive tension between really holding on to the methodologies and mindsets of particular disciplines while also engaging across disciplines and other sectors seems to be a part of the descriptions of both of the examples that you all have given us so far.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more later, but I think that kind of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary engagement is just as Chris was describing, both encouraged and often not rewarded for a lot of reasons. And so we could probably talk more about that later.
Kim, I wonder, in your own work, it sounds like you're working across all kinds of sectors. What that experience has been like, what's challenging, what makes it worthwhile?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And Jason and John Paul, I knew about Nicole Fleetwood's work, but this other project by I believe her name is Crystal. I missed her last name, but I see the link here. Thank you for that. Those projects are amazing. But to your point, Teresa, there are challenges in working so sort of expansively as you are trying to, respond to a particular moment in time. And, that certainly this idea of values-based scholarship really came to the forefront for me when the pandemic broke out. And I tell this story a lot, so I'll just briefly restate it here, is that, when the pandemic occurred and it was clear that this shutdown was going to, extend beyond, what any one of us had imagined initially, I actually asked myself that question: what were my values as a scholar, and what could I do in this moment as a scholar? Certainly I'm not a first responder in a traditional sense. And I had an extraordinary amount of privilege being able to work from home and not have any disruption in my income. And I really thought of myself as a humanist, and I knew that data was important. And I knew that I wasn't a data scientist, but I knew that I could, first and foremost, call for more data, because in the beginning it was really sketchy, but then think critically about how to make sure we just didn't stop at data, right? And that we were able to move beyond data in terms of telling the story of the pandemic. And that's really how COVID Black emerged. But Teresa, as you say, it is incredibly, it is incredibly challenging, because I was working on another project, but my values told me that I was needed in a moment. There was work that I could do in that moment, which required me to shift gears. And ultimately it's absolutely worked out. And I feel like, I'm being called to do what, I am supposed to be doing. But trying to hold disciplines in one hand, or in both hands at the same time, and work with different people. So to your point, Chris, about collaboration, it's incredibly important. And one of I think the keys to collaboration is really, first, understanding what your collaborators are doing from their discipline, respecting it and valuing it, and being able to live with the tensions, right, that sometimes come up with those collaborations, or the way that the disciplines can bump up against each other, right? And that's been very challenging. I'm working with health informatics now, and as a historian, as a humanist, I'm always sort of like clenching my fist about, things that I don't think that they're seeing, right? And it requires me to step back and really shift my positionality to first get in the shoes of a health informatics perspective, and then move from there, as opposed to sort of, you guys really should be thinking about race, and you really should be doing this, right? And so I think when we think about collaborations, when we think about values-based, and Chris, I love values. I want to make sure that I got this correctly. Values enacted based assessment. I can't tell you, that will be in my language and my, the way that I talk about values-based scholarship moving forward, because there's something very powerful about enacting something, putting it into motion, as opposed to the very passive values-based assessment or values-based scholarship. So I would just yes, it's incredibly challenging, but ultimately I think it's been worth it. I have been working with, medical professionals, doctors specifically, as well, again, people in health information systems. And my work has grown by leaps and bounds. And I would hope that they might be able to say the same thing through the engagement that we've had together.
That's so exciting. And it actually, well, since we also have your earlier projects, one of the concerns I hear from a number of colleagues around the country about publicly engaged work in particular and values-driven work is their anxiety that, I work in an earlier period. I work in 19th century or in classics. And where does that leave me? And I wonder how you've thought about that with the work you've done in the 19th century, but examples others of you have that where you've seen people find ways to build that bridge instead of feel displaced by a presentist impulse.
So I work in the early 20th century. So, I'm a historian in the traditional sense. And I always used to joke with my colleagues saying that, I work in the early 20th century, so I don't have to talk to people that are alive. I can just be in the archive, right? That was my little joke. But, even as a traditionally formed historian, my work and myself as a scholar, I'm truly a Black Studies, Africana Studies scholar. And fundamentally what that has meant and what that means is to the values base of Africana Black Studies is community. And that no matter what your scholarship is, to bridge it to communities so that it informs communities, whether it's informing them in terms of knowledge of a history or a past that they may not be aware of, helping to communities understand how we get from the past to the present, bringing that work into the community. And that's what was driving me with COVID Black. I understood myself fundamentally as a Black Studies, Africana Studies scholar. And I asked myself, what are the ways that we can tell the story of Black communities, but also to sort of demystify data. So I took my work into the community this past summer into Hartford, Connecticut, and I trained a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds on how to collect oral histories about the pandemic in Hartford, Connecticut. So that's the way, I'm an early 20th century historian, but I was able to go in and engage a community and build off of very, theoretical, methodological approaches to history and teach them on how to think about ways that they become agents and narrators of their own history and tell a story of the pandemic that has not been really known because, Hartford is a very small area and hasn't really reached the national attention of some of the larger cities. So I would say to your classic scholar, I would say to someone who is working in a field that they might seem to be very disparate or disconnected from the community, ask the community what is it that they need, right? What is the community, is what ways I can engage community, ask from that community perspective. But I want to go back to what Chris said again. What are your values, right? And how does your scholarship really reflect those values? And I can't say enough. I'm so happy Chris was able to start us off on this conversation because I think the necessity of reflection and thinking about what it is that we do and why we do it, I think is so, so important. And to make sure that there is alignment and making sure that we're in spaces and working with administrators that give us that opportunity to reflect and make those connections.
Thank you for that, Kim. That's very inspiring. And I wondered if any of the rest of you had thoughts about the place of people who are working in earlier periods and where values lead them. And Chris, I suspect you're actually that yourself.
Yes, I appreciate that. Yeah, I actually wanted to respond to that and then also maybe push the conversation a little bit to some of the structural responses that we've tried to make in the College of Arts and Letters here at Michigan State to address some of the things, Kim, that you're raising about, how are administrators creating the space for the kind of self-reflection. I have a few, as you might imagine, a few thoughts, and in fact, actually a model that I'm happy to share with people that briefly that might help in that regard. Yeah, I'm an ancient Greek philosophy is my area. And so my solution to the challenge that you were faced with, Kim, was to co-found the Public Philosophy Journal. And the vision of that journal is to try to co-create with members of the public scholarship. So the view, it's sort of bringing, just as you were talking about, Kim, bringing the values of ancient Greek philosophy around dialogue, around public engagement into a contemporary environment. Also all kinds of questions around the oral tradition versus the written tradition. And so bringing that into this space with the Public Philosophy Journal, which is really designed to model a formative review process. So it's a we call it collaborative community review, in which what we do is we invite people, when they submit artifacts to us, to identify a member of the community that might be connected with the work that they're doing, to serve as a reviewer of the work. And we also then sort of coordinate that review so that we are actually co-creating scholarship together with the public more broadly, and doing so in a way that, we have some values, as you can imagine, associated with that. We ask people to review it with an eye toward clarity of language, so not the jargon. We really want, we do think we can have sophisticated argumentation without all the jargon. We ask for them to think about the relevance of the question to a given kind of community, and how direct does it impact this community, and to what degree are the community themselves involved in the shaping of the work. We also ask them to think about the scholarly dialogue around this area. And, are you engaged with what's happening in the academy about it? And then we also look for kind of how it hangs together, the coherence of the argument. So those sort of four pieces, we ask people to kind of join us in reviewing. We ask people to enter into the review process as if you were giving feedback to a friend, not, in order to try to help enhance the work as opposed to knock it down and destroy it, which we have all experienced that dynamic. It is an open review process. We take it seriously that people should know each other a little bit as they engage in this process, and we think the work is better because people are able to have more candid conversations with each other. And we've done some very interesting work around food ethics, around incarceration. We've had some articles that were co-authored with incarcerated individuals, and we're continuing to. We have an issue coming out on the banned fish, which should be, if we can get that one going, we may really go viral. We'll see. So in any way, that's the kind of hope that we're, how can we do scholarship together with the public in a meaningful way?
I wanted to briefly touch on something that Jason said about the essential, interest in the humanities and social sciences, and how they are speaking to many of the most important things, questions that we're grappling with right now. But there really is intense public interest in the humanities, and as we've seen, sometimes really that cause really difficult conversations, especially about the distant past, especially about things that are not contemporary. We see that in conversations about our history in the United States, the ones that Jason alluded to. But Teresa, your colleague Sarah Bond here at Iowa is no stranger to finding that the ancient Mediterranean world is something that people have a lot of vested interest in thinking about in a particular way, and that it's contested in many ways. We've seen with our learned societies that members talking about this, the medievalists really grappling with understandings of what Europe is and what tradition is. And so I would just say, for on the one side, that there are times when people want to fend off public interest in their work, even if it's very distant in the past. But there are a lot of opportunities for connecting and engaging in the ways that really speak to, as Kim was bringing up, the values behind our interest in these topics. And then to the structural point that Chris brought up, I really think it's critical for us always to be asking sort of who's at the table and who's taking part in these projects. And this is something that is an evolving process, I think, for those of us who are invested in peer review, for those of us who are invested in convening. ACLS through the Henry Luce Foundation is working on a project called the Design Workshop for a New Academy that is bringing together project groups from different research universities to think including graduate students, tenure line faculty, non-tenure line faculty, administrators, and others to be part of sort of problem solving and thinking about new ways of thinking about evaluation, thinking about the evolution of different kinds of curriculum, doctoral education among them. The question of where we start the conversation and who is present from the beginning of those conversations is, I think, something that a lot of us are probably grappling with more and more. And to your point, Teresa, about the publicly engaged humanities, there's the question of who has a stake in this and who should be thinking with members of this academic community, members of the campus community, about the impacts and outputs of this work, because it relies so drastically on the contributions, many times less compensated than they should be, of community members. So I'm really excited to hear more from Chris too about how this is working in their review process.
Yeah, I think, John Paul, what you and Chris are making me think of are a couple of things. And Teresa, I hope we can get to the foundations question, because I think that's such an important part of this. And what I see from my vantage point, foundations really shifting more to thinking more expansively and more critically about community engaged, values enacted work. But I also think that we don't do enough of talking about the ways that we are all part of communities ourselves, right? Both on and off campus. And that we continue to talk, and I do the same thing in this bifurcated way, as though there's the, academy, higher ed, and the community, right? And I think we need to start talking about the ways those intersect in our own lived experiences, right? To sort of break down the ways that sometimes we work in these silos. So that's the first thing I would say. And I've been trying to do that more when I think about working with the Black community, and really like the communities of Black people that I'm working with, and making sure that the work that I do is, it certainly can't speak to everyone. I think I've been, the maturing adult part of me understands that it's not possible to be something or one thing for everyone, but to be really, visible and transparent about that, and at least to make sure that in terms of engaging different types of communities, that's acknowledged, right, about what we're trying to do. But this foundation question, I think, is so important, because when I'm thinking about foundations and thinking about Mellon right now, and I'm only talking about it from a personal experience, I know that the work I'm doing with Black Beyond Data, Mellon was very invested in making sure that we were going to be working with the community and making sure that there was a substantive relationship with that community, that it wasn't just, we were checking off a box in order to increase our competitiveness or the likelihood that we would receive the funding. And I'm really incredibly proud to say that, we were working with the St. Francis Neighborhood Center with data, developing a data hub and a data infrastructure for the West Baltimore community. And this project is funded by Mellon. I've also worked with the Council of Library and Information Resources, where they are also and have long been asking their applicants for who are applying for hidden collections grants, digitization grants, to partner and to collaborate. That's a incredibly important part of that application. And then just the work that Jason is doing at the Social Science Research Council. I've had the pleasure of also working with him and his and that community. They're really Mike Miller on a grant program as well. Same thing, the real attention to community. And I don't know, even 5, 7, definitely not 10 years ago, would you have seen this shift? And I think it was already happening, but I think the pandemic has created more openings to think about, humanities evidence-based humanities value enacted scholarship on a foundational level about who's getting funded.
And Jason and John Paul, I would love to hear how, I mean, not to be inappropriate, but your in-house conversations or your big conversations with your constituents, how you all are thinking about aligning the values of the organization with what you want to fund, and what you see in the next 5 years, the directions that you might be going in, that it will affect the work that we could be funded to do.
No, I mean, it's a great question, and I love all these examples that have been coming up. I would point to a couple more, that we've been working on that speak to this issue. I mean, one, I have colleagues, Alexa Dietrich and Sarah Jappi, who work on the Trans-Regional Collaboratory on the Indian Ocean program, which is also a Mellon-funded program. SSRC is an interesting space because we give a lot of grants away, and we also receive a lot of grants to support our work, and we partner with Mellon quite a bit. But this program focuses specifically on scholars around the Indian Ocean region, right? And it's really focusing on issues of like, what's happening when trade patterns are disrupted? What happens with migration dynamics and their change? What happens with environmental issues such as saltwater intrusion, right? But it also really emphasizes fostering a model of kind of trans-regional research ethics that focuses not specifically on helping South to South collaboration. So scholars from the region collaborating with each other, as opposed to, which is often has been the traditional model of scholars, say from the United States, sort of directly stepping in and intervening and engaging. How can we better support collaborations amongst scholars who are most deeply impacted and informed by their regional and context? So I think that's just a great example. And I think, along the lines that have already been raised, there are several ways I think we're all reflecting on the impact that research has on the communities in which we're engaging. I know another area at SSRC, working from NSF funding, we have a group of my colleagues who are working specifically exploring diversity, equity, inclusion in review processes, and working in concert with several scholarly societies to examine what their policies are in place now, what are the mechanisms that might be changed to really, as Kim suggests, think through what are our preconceived notions moving in. How do we rethink even the ways that we frame review questions and review criteria? Not going back to what Chris said earlier, this is not in any way lowering standards, it's actually elevating the standards, but it's making us question our preconceived notions about how we go about doing things in order to enhance those processes. I mean, and one other issue is just thinking through research ethics in general, right? And this has come up time and time again already, right? Where Kim has talked about how do we go about engaging with the communities in which we're doing work, with whom we're doing work. How do we involve them? How do we engage them? And so in this applies both in sort of more ethnographic or kind and historical research, but also in terms of larger scale. Things like traditional IRB, for example, is very good about studies that involve medical procedures and so forth. It's not good with, say, social data research at all. We've run a number of competitions, and a lot, overwhelmingly, IRB comes back as exempt or not applicable, even with the revisions of the Common Rule recently. But we know that social media study of social media can bring harm to individuals and groups. And so we've built out a scaffolded framework of trying to add another layer of ethical review process on top of the traditional peer review process. And this, again, as Chris raised earlier with the Public Philosophy Journal, it's not meant to serve as a gotcha moment. It's instead meant to create a conversation between reviewers and applicants so that they can have these moments of reflection about what their project's about and the potential benefits and harm that may come from them, and also come up with strategies to reduce the potential harm and increase the potential benefits. And then we have series of, we all know about grant reporting and everything else, but, building into the grant reporting follow-ups specifically about these research ethics questions so that these moments of reflection aren't a single moment, but a continuous conversation. So I think those are some of the ways that we're trying to tackle this issue, but I'd love to hear more about what ACLS is doing as well.
I would say that some of these are very similar conversations to what's happening at ACLS. If I could start with the last thing that Jason brought up first, which is the moment of reporting on research. We're really trying to ask ourselves, are we asking the right questions? Are we engaging the scholars and teams that we fund in ways that are allow for reflection? Are they bringing out the right kind of questions to bear? And are we encouraging that kind of reflection? Are we encouraging an openness to talking about difficult things and not just I was funded so I must show success, or I was funded so I must show a particular outcome that might look differently across different projects. The number of people who have abashedly said, oh, I didn't finish my monograph, as if the monograph is the highest form of scholarly output, or the only one that you could think of as a successful product. But we're really funding sort of long-term projects, multi-year projects that have many different stages and many moments of realization, many moments of understanding, and we want to make sure that we're supporting that. One of the things that I think you'll see us doing more of is working with past awardees to ask them to help us evaluate, to help them map out areas of work, to have them sort of co-create guides to the kind of work that we think is important, the kind of work that we feel needs to be funded in the future. So I envision more sort of reflection that will be made public, not just private reports, but we're starting to invite people to participate in sort of public-facing evaluation, public-facing reflections on their work, in an effort not just to understand the work a little bit better, but to invite new applicants, new folks who are interested in doing the work that we want to support, to come at it with more openness and an interest in dialogue with us, and not seeing a particular binary between funder and the scholar who's funded.
And I'll just say, as one of the many fortunate people who's been part of some of the conversations that ACLS has been having and thinking sessions, it's just very inspiring to see how thoughtfully you all are going about asking these questions and inviting others to participate in those conversations. So thank you for that, John Paul. I also so appreciate that both of you have just given us a lot of really concrete examples of how to change the way we work to be more equitable and inclusive in very particular ways. And Chris, this might end up being the kind of final word, but I know that as a dean, not only have you and Jason and the others been so involved in the Humetrics project, but you and Bill and others have thought so hard about what a dean and a dean's office can do to support the work of their faculty when you want to see the change at your own institution. And I would love to hear more about the structures you've created, how you thought about that process.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Teresa. I did hear, Kim, you seem to want to add something to the previous point. So let me open that space for a sec.
Thanks, Chris. All I wanted to say was to Jason and John Paul, their conversation made me think about foundations in a way I hadn't thought about before as co-creators, right? I've always thought about foundations as funders, as sort of just a very specific way to do the work that I would like to do. But the way that you're creating dialogue and transparency and really publicly facing engaged work, I'm rethinking that conceptualization. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you, and I'm sorry that I missed you, Kim.
No,
Thank you for bringing Kim in.
Yeah, no worries. Actually, so Kim, I want to convince you to see, the dean's office as a possible co-partner in that same vein. So,
Chris, if you were my dean, I would certainly say that, but not all deans are made alike. I'll just say leave it there.
Fair enough. So what we've tried to do, and I don't know if I think I can share my screen really briefly here. What we've tried to actually do in the college, I can, Teresa. So I think in the College of Arts and Letters at MSU is shift our focus a little bit. So in the traditional tenure and promotion, 3 legs of the stool, right? Teaching, research, and service. But what we found is that actually ends up tearing apart a holistic approach to research and teaching and all the work, all the amazing work. In fact, all the projects we've just been talking about have this integrated kind of way of thinking about all those activities. So we've actually developed a framework which we call creating pathways of intellectual leadership. And here's the little diagram for it. We've actually, rather than teaching, research, and service, we ask people every year to, how have you shared knowledge? You can share knowledge through your research, through your teaching. You can share knowledge through blogging, through publishing, all kinds of different ways, through community engaged work. How have you expanded opportunity? And again, you can expand opportunity through all different kinds of activities, not just teaching, research, and service. And then the third part we ask is around mentorship and stewardship. We know that mentorship work, which is so critical to the success of so many students and junior faculty and other colleagues, is often invisible work that we want to be able to recognize and amplify and move forward. So this sort of shift from teaching, research, and service, which in many ways are means to the ends of sharing knowledge, expanding opportunity, and mentorship and stewardship, is allowing us to have structured conversations with our faculty as they move through the tenure and promotion process, exactly along the lines of what we've been talking about, of sort of opportunities for self-reflection. So we ask our faculty, what are your career horizon goals? So we ask them then in that context to think in a future perfect way. What will I have accomplished? What will I have been known for by the time I retire? What will that person who's lifting their glass to toast me at the end of my career say about me? Then let's look at the milestones that might lead in that direction. What are those milestones? Tenure and promotion might be one of them, but engaging community in specific kinds of ways, different kinds of winning certain kinds of awards might be milestones. And then we take it back to the next 6 to 12 months here. What are the stepping stones that you need to undertake in the next year or so? And let's let those be your goals for the year. Let's orient our tenure and promotion question to those values enacted, stepping stone, and then milestone and horizon level goals. So that, and then what we do is we document that through the process. So, and there's a lot of work to do here. We've got a lot of training around the chairs with respect to how to have those mentoring conversations. We've developed some rubrics for that. But I think that shift from pulling research apart, pulling everything apart, pulling the work apart into teaching, research, and service. And with so many conversations I've had, it drives me nuts. Well, does this count as service? Does this count as, what does this count as? Well, I don't, share knowledge, expand opportunity, mentorship and stewardship. Those are the kind of higher order achievements and goals and activities that we want to reaffirm. So we're, trying to weave that into bylaws at the unit level, and we're beginning to have some documented success in terms of our recent last few years of promotion and tenure. And by the way, this model is also adaptable for non-tenure system faculty. It's adaptable to actually staff. We've had a lot of luck with, support staff thinking in this kind of, what contribution do we want to make? We want to help you chart your path to intellectual leadership. The other piece here, I want to just recognize for the record, somebody doing very traditional scholarship can do very well with this charting pathways of intellectual leadership model. That, if your way of sharing knowledge is writing that research or writing that university press book, which I'm a big fan of and love, that's a great way to share knowledge. So we're trying to open it up so that the people who are doing the transdisciplinary work, publicly engaged work, the work around diversity, equity, inclusion, transformative work, don't have to fight to create the space for that, even as we continue to affirm, the kind of more traditional model of moving forward. So that's what we're working on.
There are very few evaluation systems that make me verklempt, Chris. Yours does. Seriously. I can see Kim feels the same way. And, I'm so it sounds like, at Michigan State at least, and that is not necessarily the place one might have predicted, given that it is, a comprehensive university with a heavy emphasis on agriculture and technology, et cetera, the sciences. But that you're moving that direction, it sounds like the foundations are moving that direction. How do we convince our colleagues? How do we convince across disciplines that even though it feels so much safer to have items you can count, like published papers in specific journals and monographs, and conference paper, a whole range of things, but countable things. How do we make people, from my biased point of view, brave enough to take on this more abstract way of evaluating one another?
Well, I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I think there's going to be resistance across, at any time to any change. But I do think that the sort of opposite of that question is how do we enable scholars who have for years done both and in order to meet the current standards, able to better articulate a vision of what their scholarly work, their scholarly life, their scholarly story is to the broader community. And I think that's where Chris's model and the work that we've been trying to do through Humetrics is really about changing the vocabulary, just empowering people to have a different vocabulary to talk through these things. Because one thing that we absolutely know in Humetrics is that these conversations, Teresa, you and your colleagues at Iowa, I think, experience this. These conversations are challenging, they're enriching, and they are difficult, through the workshops and such that we've done. So I think that having that conversation, and then I think having models like the ones that Chris has articulated and is enacting at Michigan State is another way to empower people. And I think, we had a recent conversation about this. I think actually, as those models start to take hold, they serve as recruitment mechanisms because people see it work and they see that they can tell a different kind of story and have a pathway past the frustrations that I think we all agree are stifling the academy at the moment. And then they serve as powerful recruitment tools, and other universities recognize that and may start to implement it. And so those are some ideas about how we might be able to do it.
Yeah, can I just affirm what Jason said? Speaking as a scholar who fit very well into the model that Chris just showed us and the values that he's laid out for how he, serves as a dean at Michigan State. It's incredibly empowering. And my own profile as a scholar, at least in my own institution, there's not language to describe me, right? And I don't have the language myself because, I've been trained in a very sort of traditional sense. So I just want to affirm what Jason says, that to empower people who are already doing the work and sort of forging their own path, but without the sort of language and the framework to explain or articulate that is incredibly important.
Well, we are right at time, and this was just such an inspiring conversation. Kim, it's a joy to know you now too, and I am so grateful. We'll be sharing the video widely and sharing it with you all in case you'd like to share with constituents, because I think in 1 hour you all have managed to capture so many of the exciting things that are going on, but also ways we really can value them, articulate what they are and why they're valuable. And, you know, as several of you opened by saying, I do think this is one of those moments where, because many of us are feeling exhausted just from dealing with COVID and our teaching and all that, it gets easy to just be slogging with our heads down. But as you all have so convincingly said, this is really the moment for the humanities. This is when we have so much to offer if we reach out to the right people and welcome them to be part of our work. And same with our students. I just see students hungry to be part of just the kind of transformation you've all described. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I look so forward to seeing all of you in person soon, once again.
Yes, thank you, Teresa.